DH. Hello, everyone. Good morning from my side. It is a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Roopika Risam. Have been, since I started with digital humanities, she has been one of my role models in the efforts and work that she has been doing in decolonial and postcolonial digital humanities. She is an associate professor of film and media studies and of comparative literature at Dartmouth College, where she is part of the digital humanities and social engagement cluster. Her research interests lie at the intersection of postcolonial and African diaspora studies, humanities knowledge, infrastructures, and digital humanities. Dr. Risam works building humanities knowledge infrastructures has been supported by various grants. And she has a long publication history. Her first monograph, New Digital Worlds, Postcolonial Digital Humanities in Theory, Praxis, and Pedagogy, was published in 2018, which examines the critical work of uncovering and remediating colonialist inequalities in digital knowledge production, and has been an important book for many scholars of color in digital humanities to open paths and start new initiatives in this discipline field or overall in digital humanities. She's the co-author of Intersectionality in Digital Humanities, published in 2019, and South Asian Digital Humanities, Postcolonial Mediation Across Technology, Cultural Canon, published in 2020. Risam's latest co-edited collection, The Digital Black Atlantic in the Debates in the Digital Humanities series, was published in 2021, and her current book project, Insurgent Academies, A Radical Account of Public Humanities, traces a new history of public humanities through the emergence of ethnic studies, and it's under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press. Similarly, Risam co-edited several public humanities initiatives, including Reanimate, an intersectional feminist digital publishing collective, and Reviews in Digital Humanities, a journal for peer-reviewing digital scholarship. Her work has appeared in journals and volumes, including several journals in digital humanities, as well as in other disciplines. I'm always admire the work that Roopika Risam does, specifically in the fields of ethnic studies, pushing towards new ways of applying digital humanities tools and practices with ethical forms that will impact communities in the United States and all over the world. Within the Digital Black Atlantic, there is a lot of push to showcase how Black communities have been using technologies that they're not new for them in the diaspora, but also to bring the use of those technologies and to recognize, as they mentioned in Digital Black Atlantic, recognize language and vocabulary for them that spans the breadth of interdisciplinary scholarship in digital studies and digital humanities, including disciplines as varied as literary studies, history, library, and information science, musicology, and communications. So this effort of James Jeku at the University of Kansas, the African Digital Humanities, is an effort to put up with those discussions. I'm very glad to have you here, Roopika, and the platform, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for your lovely introduction. It's so nice to see all of you. Good morning. I hope you can't hear the fact that my neighbor has decided to mow their lawn. It's very loud. So hopefully this will not get in our way. Thank you so much to James for the invitation to be here, for everyone who has worked to organize this, Brian, Anabima, And KU Digital Humanities folks are some of my favorite digital humanities people. So it's particularly exciting for me to be part of today's wonderful event. And I'm going to be speaking today on what I see as some of the promises and some of the perils of digital humanities in post-colonial contexts. And some of what I'll talk about comes from my experience writing my first book, New Digital Worlds. Some comes from my experience co-editing the volume, The Digital Black Atlantic, for the Debates in the Digital Humanities series. And I'll be offering some of my latest thinking as someone thinking about some of the challenges of putting what we might call a post-colonial digital humanities into practice. And I want to note that my own background in post-colonial studies is in the African diaspora and South Asia. So my hope is in the Q&A we'll have some time to hear from you about your sense of where this work intersects with the important advances you are all leading in African digital humanities. If you'd like a copy of my slides, you can use this QR code. You could also visit the link tinyurl.com/RismAfricanDH, and you can have a copy. So I want to begin with the promise and the potential of digital humanities. For me, digital humanities has always been an approach to scholarship that is possessed with tremendous but unrealized potential. In his 2014 book, A New Republic of Letters, Jerome McGann issues this important provocation that it's a truth now universally acknowledged that the whole of our cultural inheritance has to be recurated and re-edited in digital forms and institutional structures. And so with the emergence of digitization, with the emergence of algorithms and databases is something we have access to using if we have access to these technologies and to the internet, our relationship to culture and history, to archives and manuscripts has been shifting for some time. And another thinker, Adam Hammond, writes in his work, Literature in the Digital Age, that there have been sort of shifts in media from codex to manuscript to printed book, and argues that digital humanities is simply one in a long line of how media has shifted over time. But I always keep asking myself, who is the hour of our cultural inheritance? And whose history of media are we talking about when we're talking about a history of media that's periodized by shifts in writing technologies developed on a timeline that is European? What happens? How do these things play out differently in countries around the world, in countries of the global South that have their own media histories? These questions are important to consider in the context of digital humanities as we think about how it may offer greater democratization of access to the means of production of knowledge. That we have, in some ways and in uneven ways, access to the technological capacities to produce digital archives, to develop algorithmic and computational approaches to humanities research. But in the light of this so-called democratization, we must also ask, whose democracy? That is to say that digital humanities, particularly digital humanities scholarship that is not based on canonical research of dominant white cultures of the global North, requires greater attention to the politics of knowledge. And it's the politics of knowledge production, of knowledge dissemination, and knowledge consumption. These are the topics that lie at the heart of my book, New Digital Worlds. The great promise of digital humanities has yet to be realized, but it lies in how it can help us both uncover and complicate our relationship between technology and the human. But this can only be the case if human is an inclusive notion, if we also count as human. But that's far from assured, because we've seen in the history of knowledge production in the humanities, whether Hegel's stunningly racist and colonialist pronouncement in the 1830s that Africans are outside of history, or Edward Said's argument that the European scholars were constructing the notion of a deficient East against which Europe could define itself as civilized and justified in colonization. The cultural texts that get published, the manuscripts and materials collected in archives, the cultural heritage objects displayed in museums reflect these hierarchies of value for knowledge. So the cultural record of humanity is one that's inflected by the histories of racism and of colonialism. So my own work is really asking how we can ensure that when folks like McGann or Hammond speak to our cultural inheritance or history of media, that ours, yours and mine, aren't the stories that are left out. Despite the promise of digital humanities, current dominant trends in digitization and algorithmic and computational analysis have reinforced the value of figures, of stories, of histories that the forces of colonialism and racism have deemed most valuable. And often they aren't ours. But we can change that. And our work is changing that in the ways that we participate in the essential project of post-colonial recovery. And this is incredibly important because what does and does not get digitized, made discoverable through metadata, the ways we undertake algorithmic and computational analysis determines what material are available to users. And as information-seeking publics are increasingly turning to the internet to gain access to the past, they're finding digital materials that are complicit in the exclusion of our people and our histories and our voices. But as the work that's been presenting, it's going to be presented at the symposium today, at the work we've seen at the symposiums in previous years, we're not going to let it be this way. Because we're doing our part to build projects that offer counter narratives, counter stories, challenges, and new perspectives that aren't being represented in the digital cultural record. In this next section of my talk, I want to offer a framework for being able to move this work forward despite the many constraints, whether they're infrastructural, financial, labor, that we encounter, particularly when doing work that by virtue of the colonial vestiges that render it less important and thus less fundable. With other colleagues, I've been examining how an approach that we've called minimal computing might advance digital humanities scholarship in our areas of research. Minimal computing is less a methodology or coherent set of methodologies than it is a mode of thinking about digital humanities practices that resists the idea that innovation must be defined by newness, scale, or scope. And this is particularly important because, as I mentioned earlier, there's uneven access to infrastructure, uneven access to funding, uneven access to labor, and that we're contending with this when we're trying to do this really important work of building a more inclusive digital cultural record. In our introduction to our minimal computing special issue of Digital Humanities Quarterly, Alex Heel and I defined minimal computing as digital humanities work undertaken in the context of some set of constraints. This could include lack of access to hardware or software, network capacity, technical education, or even a reliable power grid. So minimal computing first and foremost advocates for using only the technologies that are necessary and sufficient for developing digital humanities scholarship. And we describe minimal computing as a heuristic that comprises 4 questions to determine what is in fact necessary and sufficient when developing a digital humanities project. The first is, what do we need? The second is, what do we have? The third is, what must we prioritize? And the fourth is, what are we willing to give up? What do we need is a question that's intended to cut through a tendency in digital humanities to valorize keeping pace with trends towards high-speed computing or the latest computational technologies. Often when we pause to consider what we actually need to do a digital humanities project, the answer isn't always or even really ever the latest and the greatest, but often the tried and the true. And the drive for innovation for its own sake can be a deterrent to actually completing or even starting a project. And this is something I've encountered at length when I work with people in digital humanities, when I work with other faculty who often feel like they need to use a particular kind of software, a particular brand of software like ArcGIS for digital mapping because it's popular and it has name brand association with digital humanities, when something simpler, like even just a Google map that you can put pins on and some images and some text could suffice and might actually mean that a project gets completed. The question of what do we have is equally critical because it encourages us to focus on the assets we have available to us rather than focusing on a deficit mindset or what we don't have. When we look at completed projects or projects that have been sustained with decades of funding from grants and institutional support, it's so easy to think, I can't do that. But instead, we need to look at the resources we do have. It might be the kinds of archives. It may be what institutional resources we can find and repurpose for our work. It could be the kinds of labor we have the ability to access. For me, this has always been about looking for potential for collaboration, for support and internal resources to steal, and to identify feasible projects and paths forward. Following the first two questions is what must be prioritized. We can't keep treating all competing priorities as in a project as if they're equally important. And this is a really crucial way of ensuring robust decision-making when we're developing a project under constraints. So for instance, by way of example, I like using Jekyll, which is a static site generation software to build websites. It's fairly easy to sustain and maintain, certainly more so than a content management system like WordPress or Drupal, which relies on a database. It also has, those have longer load times for web pages in environments with low internet bandwidth. So that's something I really like to use when I develop projects. It's a technology that's often associated with minimal computing, but as we've tried to say in the introduction to the minimal computing special issue, we're pushing back against the idea that minimal computing is about using certain tools, but rather it's about a way of thinking about designing projects that are going to be feasible in the context in which we're working. But when I was building a website for a project called the Digital Ethnic Futures Consortium, which I'll say a little bit about at the end of my talk, I actually decided I was going to use WordPress, not Jekyll, because I was working with a group of people who didn't know how to use Jekyll. They had no interest in it. They had no time to invest in the learning curve. And so in that case, I prioritized people over platforms to ensure full participation for all my collaborators, because that was the real clear priority there. And then the last question is, what are we willing to give up? Because all of our environments that we're working in have limitations. Maybe their infrastructure, maybe their financial, maybe their labor, maybe their technical knowledge, or maybe it's all of the above. We simply can't have it all. And there are tough decisions to be made as we develop projects that taking into account what we need and what we have and what we must prioritize. So this may mean saying, we're not going to use the latest, flashiest methods because those would cost more money, time, and labor than we really have. And instead, taking a simpler approach that may be practically achievable with what we have. Or it may mean choosing a platform or a tool that doesn't meet every desired requirement that we or our team can imagine or even want, but still make it possible to move a project forward. So the minimal in minimal computing is a stark contrast to an implied maximal in digital humanities projects, where maximal connotes design choices that are made without putting the question of what is necessary and sufficient at the heart of decision making. When we're working in areas that are outside of what is deemed to be valuable and deemed to be worth funding or investing in a context of a dominant culture and a dominant academic culture that is very much defined by white history, white literature, white culture in the global North, those of us who are working outside of that, whether you're like me and working in African diaspora studies, whether you're working in African studies, when you're working in Latinx studies, border studies, we don't have the luxury to try and not make our decisions based on the ability to accrue grant funding and significant institutional resources. Because if we keep waiting, we're never going to have anything. Instead, minimal computing is trying to offer a way forward to think about how to focus what we do have to get our projects out there, because that is ultimately what is going to change the digital cultural record. I want to give you an example of how minimal computing has informed a project that I'm working on that explores the history of Pan-Africanism and Afro-Asian solidarities. And actually, this is a really good example of how I failed at following the minimal computing rules initially, because I was really fixated on what do I want and not on what do I need. And that actually led to a failure of my original plans. But reframing my thinking through what do we need has actually given birth to a new project with far more exciting possibilities than I'd imagined in the first place, and possibilities that are actually more richer for those of us working in Black digital humanities than my original idea would have been anyway. So a few years ago, I began exploring data-driven approaches to Black diaspora studies. And this first started with my work on W.E.B. Du Bois, who's sometimes called the grandfather of Pan-Africanism, in a project where I'm exploring how data can be used to address some of the myths that surround his career. As you may know, Du Bois died in Ghana, where he had moved in the later years of his life. And the conventional narratives of his biography suggest that he cared about African Americans in the first part of his life, then turned his back on them in favor of anti-colonial movements on the continent of Africa and around the world in the middle of his career. This is totally a fictional narrative, because it's clear from his writing that Du Bois saw a mutual relationship between African Americans living under Jim Crow and colonized people around the world, and that this was happening throughout his career from the very beginning. And there are all kinds of political reasons why this weird narrative has appeared in his biography, and it has to do with the fact that he became a communist at a time when the Black political establishment in the US was actively trying to distance itself from communism, because in the US, a politician named Joseph McCarthy was trying to, bring down the communists. And so it was not exigent for Black emancipation in the US to be associated with the communists. So I've been trying to use data to tell a different kind of story. For example, how networks of his correspondence revealed new narratives. So like, for example, some of the work has unearthed his concern about neocolonialism through the Firestone Tire Company in Liberia in the 1920s. So this is, there are these other narratives that I've been thinking about, how do we use data to uncover and to tell these stories. So my work on Du Bois, though, led me to interest in the broader question of who was active in Pan-Africanist movements And so I ended up creating data sets containing names and biographical information for attendees of Pan-Africanist events. This is the Pan-Africanism Data Project, which you can see the a screenshot of the GitHub repo for on this slide. And so my goal, and I should be clear that this is what I wanted and not what I needed, was to create a network analysis to see if computationally modeling the relationships based on attendance at multiple events might reveal new insights on who the key figures in Pan-Africanism were. But guess what? It didn't. I ended up with a giant hairball network visualization with absolutely no meaningful new insights to be found, which actually makes sense historically. Very few people had the means to travel or freedom of a movement to attend multiple events. So attendance was hyper local. Unless you were a big shot like Du Bois or Kwame Nkrumah, the usual suspects of Pan-Africanism who were able to travel and attend more of these events. So this is a clear example of how sometimes we can get so carried away with the technical that we lose sight of what we even just know, historically or culturally. But I was pretty frustrated that, in my view, network analysis had failed me. And then I realized that I'd failed by being focused on what I wanted or what I thought I wanted, rather than being focused on the analytical and research possibilities of the work that I was doing, which is what I really needed. And because I'd been so focused on the network analysis idea, I couldn't even see any other potential value for 8 months of archival research that I'd been doing to create these data sets. And it was really distressing because I thought, oh, I did all this work and nothing came of it, and what now? But then I was talking to a friend of mine, Quinn Dombrowski, who does a lot of work in multilingual digital humanities and has been a leader of Sucho, which is the effort to sustain Ukrainian cultural heritage and preserve Ukrainian digital cultural heritage. And Quinn encouraged me to think about other questions, other kinds of value for this research, and what the field needed. And so this turned out to be, she was the right person to talk to, because that ended up becoming the genesis for Linking the Black Atlantic, which is a project that I'm now working on as a fellow for AdHum, the African American Digital Humanities Initiative at the University of Maryland. And the purpose of the project is to find a way to make the data sets that researchers of the Black Atlantic are making, often without knowledge or without interest in how to structure data or do digital humanities, how these data sets can come interoperable with each other. This is what you see is the vision board that I created for my application. I had to make a vision board sort of visually representing what I was hoping for. So you see these sort of various data sets and projects that I'm trying to link. I'm going to move on from this slide because I think it's slowing down my Zoom because I'm seeing a delay. So I'm just going to move on from this slide. So to make these data sets interoperable with each other requires exploring the tension between the standardization that's required of approaches, technical approaches like linked open data, and the particularities of Black diaspora data sources that may not fit conventions for standardization that are created based on white dominant ways of knowing of the global north or ways of thinking about data. So what I'm doing is bringing together some colleagues who've been doing similar work, like Edward Arriaga at Clark University has been creating data sets of Pan-Africanist events in Latin America and the Caribbean, which doesn't overlap with mine because mine have mostly been events in the US, Europe, and on the continent of Africa and in Asia, as well as the folks behind the Afro-Asian Networks Project, who've done data sets of Afro-Asian events like the Afro-Asian Writers Conference, the Bandung Conference, and things like that, to think through these issues. And I'm only in the thinking phase on this. And the initial goal between now and the end of the year is to create the data model and to explore the possibilities of how Wikidata and authority lists might help negotiate some of those particularities of the data sets. And the longer term goal would be to try and see maybe we develop a Wikibase and other methods of ingestion for other data sets, so that people who are doing this research and creating these data sets, but they're creating them in, sort of ad hoc structured comma separated value files, or in some people are doing them in Microsoft Word docs. How do we think about ways that we can bridge between the person who's interested in this research and wants to contribute it to an aggregate data source, but isn't really interested in the technical, like what kind of scripts would we need, what technical pieces that I'm interested in thinking about that could bridge between Black diaspora researcher and aggregatable data. And what's really exciting about this project is that the potential is actually far more far-reaching than creating the network data visualization that I failed to create in the first place. It's more speculative. It could have more impact on data-driven approaches to the Black diaspora. So that's been a really positive way that actually taking my own advice and following a minimal computing approach has moved me towards something way more productive. And in doing so, it's actually meeting some of the goals that we lay out in the Digital Black Atlantic, which you can see the cover of here. And there's a link at the bottom. It's open access and freely available. So the link at the bottom of this slide will let you read it. So we talk about the importance of developing new digital humanities methods that attend to the particularities of the Black diaspora in digital academic knowledge production. So it's more of what I'm doing through the revised project than what I thought I was doing in the first place. So far, I've been speaking about the promises of postcolonial digital humanities, how minimal computing can play a role in helping us actually get our work done despite the constraints in which we're working, and to more fully realize the promises of digital humanities. But I want to be sure to address the perils. My book, New Digital Worlds, has enjoyed a warm welcome from many corners of digital humanities. And my intention while writing it, my audience while writing it, was actually digital humanities practitioners of the global north. I wanted to urge those of us who work in these spaces to examine how the research and the technical and the design choices that we make can, if we're not careful, reinstantiate the canons of literature and history and culture. And this was, the book was really just a summation of many conversations and advocacy undertaken in collaboration with many colleagues over the years, including with organizations like Global Outlook Digital Humanities or GoDH. But even digital humanists, it turns out, are more likely to believe something if you put it in a book. So New Digital Worlds found an audience in the global north. And as a scholar who is trained in postcolonial studies in the US, I was very much writing in that tradition, concerned that those of us who practice digital humanities in the Academy of the Global North are doing harm, however unintentionally. I wanted us to collectively consider alternate ways of thinking and making with digital humanities, and consider our role in decentering the digital humanities practices of the Global North. And I was urging those of us working in the Global North to rethink forms of building, of collaboration, of teaching, of organization that could resist reifying colonial histories and practices and politics in digital scholarship, both through attention to the content that's represented in our projects and to how we develop tools, how we develop our projects. And the book has been taught in quite a few classes in the US, in Canada, in Western Europe, has been cited quite a bit. And so it shows that I did reach that intended audience. But New Digital Worlds found another audience among scholars from the Global South. And the feedback I've received from them is somewhat unsettling to me, because I've been told that they feel like they can do their work because of my book when they were already doing important work well before it. Or thanking me for inspiring them when their work has long inspired me. or said my book gave them a voice when they already had one. And these are very kind assessments, but they bring me both surprise and discomfort because these practitioners were not my intended audience, and because they are the experts on digital humanities in the Global South, not me. And I wasn't speaking to them, and I wasn't speaking for them. And what was really ironic is that these responses ended up rehearsing a troubling trend that I had identified in New Digital Worlds, which is the way that well-circulated writing in the Global North frequently becomes what gets taught and what gets cited in scholarship in digital humanities, including in the Global South. And the danger of this phenomenon is that it overshadows local expertise and threatens to replace or forestall the growth of local digital humanities practices with some kind of fictional global that isn't global or universal. It's just pretending to be. There are particular practices of the Global North that are masquerading as a universal. So this unanticipated reception for New Digital Worlds has actually made me wonder or reconsider what kind of harm might post-colonial digital humanities be doing, and what kind of refinements and nuances for the framework are necessary to try and mitigate harm. So I want to speak to 2 points on this in the interest of time. The first is the overdetermination of post-colonial thought by the US and European academies. And the second is the centering of post-colonial elite in digital humanities discourses. These are both critiques that could be made, have been made of post-colonial studies more generally, but I raise them here because it's important that we attend to them to ensure that post-colonial digital humanities doesn't become another way, yet another hegemonic discourse that loses sight of the needs of the most vulnerable communities. Certainly, the global scholarly contexts in which we operate are playing a role in this. Post-colonial studies has been a part of the emergence of the academic star system in the Academy of the Global North since the 1980s, has really overemphasized the voices of those who are working in the Global North, often emigres, over the voices of those who are working in the Global South. So the geospatial terrain of postcolonial studies is heavily skewed towards scholars in the US and Europe. And this is born from these uneven distribution of institutional resources, legacies of colonialism that have shaped the landscape of higher education and of knowledge production more generally. Plus, of course, the relative wealth of US and European institutions that have allowed them to attract and retain postcolonial scholars, contributing to brain drain as they turn the US and the Europe into the centers of postcolonial knowledge production, which, by the way, sounds an awful lot like colonialism. And yet, I think to the important work that's taking place in countries on the continent of Africa, clear sets of postcolonial theories, clear digital humanities practices that are not derivative of scholarship produced in the Global North. They are practices that were developed in response to particular linguistic and cultural needs, to institutional and labor contexts of universities in African countries. Yet teaching and research continually refers back to and frames scholarship not through this important work, but through scholarship of the Global North, including my own. Thus, I want to make the case for the importance of a politics of citation that validates scholarship in African countries through the communities of practice that developed there, not through a framework that recenters scholars located in the Global North. One of the most frustrating movements I've encountered lately in the US is the we're going to decolonize everything movement. We're going to decolonize our syllabus. We're going to decolonize the university. This is very much a trend right now in US and UK for sure, higher education. And this is given rise to the sense if we change our syllabus a little bit or change admissions policy a little bit, we somehow achieve decolonization. When decolonization is in fact about regaining total ownership over land, over culture, over self-determination, a complete unmaking of systems of colonialism and capitalism, where changing your syllabus isn't going to cut it. I hold post-colonial studies largely responsible for this in the way that they've emphasized discourse and understanding the role of discourse in colonialism as somehow being a sufficient move towards decolonization. But discourse is not enough when so many in the world, both in the US and in other countries, continue to live under colonialism. When we believe in the fallacy of discursive post-coloniality, we're at risk of believing that representation in the eyes of dominant culture of the global North is enough. For example, there's a wonderful digital humanities conference at Michigan State, the Global DH Conference. It often features the work of scholars from countries in Africa, and it's a great event. But we have to ask ourselves, which scholars, from which countries, from which ethnic groups, from which socioeconomic backgrounds have access to that or to other digital humanities channels? And just to be clear, I'm not criticizing the conference or its organizers. They're really wonderful people. They do great work. I love that conference. I'm criticizing the way that there are political, social, and economic factors that have a role in who gets to participate, who gets represented, whose voices, whose work gets recovered, and whose does not. So I can tell you how this plays out in my own life and my own work. So I'm in the US. I'm South Asian, which means that I'm relatively privileged in the context of US racial hierarchy, not as much as white people, but certainly more so than Black and Latinx and Indigenous people. I work at Dartmouth, which is an elite university. I've been there 3 months. Previously, I spent 9 years working at an under-resourced public university doing digital humanities with absolutely no budget. In the US, the work in digital humanities by those of us who aren't white, those of us who aren't in elite universities, has been underrepresented. And we've seen tremendous gains with that. And I've benefited from it professionally with publications and grants and a new fancy job. But my job is not to say, great, I've got these things, my work is visible, my work is represented, this is enough, but rather to think about how do I then use those gains to think about how do we redistribute resources to scholars and communities who don't have that. So that's what we're doing through the Digital Ethnic Futures Consortium, which is intended to create a research and teaching community for ethnic studies fields in digital humanities. We do events. They're freely, they're on Zoom, they're recorded. So, everybody is welcome to attend, regardless of where they are, regardless of whether they work on ethnic studies. There's a lot of wonderful resources on teaching digital humanities. We give out money to scholars at under-resourced universities in the US with large Black and Latinx student populations so that they can do digital humanities too. So, if we are people who have access to channels for representation of our scholarship to do this work, our responsibility is to think about how do we use our position to create access for other people. I think about this in the context of South Asia, for example, where digital humanities scholarship is thriving, but it reproduces caste hierarchies where digital humanities resources are accruing to people who are upper caste and not to lower caste communities or to India's indigenous communities. So we have to keep asking in our own local contexts, what can we do to not reproduce the internal hierarchies and power dynamics of the cultures and communities in which we live to ensure that ethnic minorities, to ensure that indigenous people, other people without access are able to get it? So the question is, how do we do this? There are just certain questions we need to keep in mind when we are doing our scholarship, right? We can think about, when we're working with materials or a project, we must consider whose voices, whose knowledges and are being privileged and valorized and whose aren't. And how do we create a space for theirs to be part of the conversation too? We can think about how do we collaborate with these communities and provide them access to the means of production of knowledge so that they can be part of this process too, but in their own voices and on their own terms. And more specifically, not on our terms, not equating any access we may have with control over a project, but rather shifting those power dynamics of academic knowledge production to create access for those who've been denied it. That is to ask, how are we participating in recovery, not just of the most elite voices, but a broader range of people. I fully believe in the ideas that I advance in New Digital Worlds, but it's important that these don't become a mechanism through which communities that have been marginalized in the global landscape of digital humanities start perpetuating a similar dynamic towards those who are subaltern in their cultural context. Doing so requires attending to the localization of postcolonial thought and of digital humanities, and of taking seriously the operations of power in our cultural contexts, and beginning by asking how we can center the most vulnerable and the most marginal of people. And only then can we more fully realize the possibilities of postcolonial digital humanities. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion, the Q&A. Oops.
Thank you so much for that talk. I learned so much from the things you're saying, especially I'm thinking about, the earlier discussion you were having on minimal computing and how I want to integrate that definitely into a class I'm teaching next semester called the Digital Black Atlantic, because we'll be going through that. So thank you so much for that. So we're opening up the floor for Q&A. We have about 15 to 20 minutes. If you would like to speak, please feel free to just, put up the hand raise function on Zoom, and I'll call on you. If you type a question into the chat box, I'd be happy to read it aloud. And while we are waiting for folks to start putting questions in the chat or raising their hands to ask a question verbally, I did want to ask you about any advice or any thoughts you have on how we might utilize and try to teach students, especially students trying to do digital humanities work, to use minimal computing, while at the same time trying to set them up to submit their work to receive grants and things like that to support the work. Because I think very often, especially when I'm looking at the sorts of projects that are overwhelmingly, you spoke a bit about this as well, that are overwhelmingly funded for digital humanities work, it is things that I feel like aren't minimal computing, right? They want sometimes the most tech involved project. But sometimes that is not what's needed for the work that folks do. So I'm wondering if you have advice on that, or if you've seen maybe any different moving trends in that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that there's a real challenge in, and this may sound like it's tangential, but I promise it's not. There's a real challenge in discovery of digital humanities projects. Often, like, how do you find them? And because we don't have, and we probably shouldn't have, because it's a technical nightmare, any sort of centralized repository or way of finding projects. And so often the projects we find are ones that, get a lot of attention, they get media coverage, they get large grants, we don't find other projects. So I, along with my colleague Jennifer Giuliano, run a journal called Reviews in Digital Humanities, and I'll put the link in the chat. And Reviews in Digital Humanities wasn't intending to be a discovery outlet for projects, but we found out that people started using it as a discovery outlet for projects in the absence of any other way to find projects. I think that's the link. So what we do is we actually peer review digital scholarship. And so if you have a digital humanities project and you want it to be peer reviewed, please submit to us. Maybe that's not the right website. Let me try that again. Please submit it to us. We're actually doing a special issue, and James is one of the guest editors on DH in Africa. So look for that call as well. But it's simply by trying to expose people to other ways of doing digital humanities, to other projects, to other ideas that are out there, to see what people are able to do with a range of access to technologies. We have, for example, a lot of projects that were undertaken by or with students. And so just being able to see, like, there are other projects out there that, you know, they use Google Maps, or they use Omeka, or they use, you know, those aren't necessarily easy to use technologies, but they can be freely available technologies. So, you know, be exposing people to a broader range of what digital humanities is, I think, really important.
Thank you so much for that answer. We have a hand raised from Elizabeth. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi there. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for this talk. It has been really helpful. And one of the things, I've been working on a project for many years, and mostly it's just a database. So when you were talking about that, creating that huge database and it being a morass, I'm in that place. And I'm trying to, part of what I'm trying to figure out is how to build the networks that I need to build to create this, both within the kind of digital community in the United States, but also internationally. You know, my project is looking at letters between Africans and Americans during decolonization. I have 7,000 entries with images to these letters. And I have no idea what to do with it, but I also really don't know how to build a network of people and to engage with this. And so that's what I'm really kind of struggling to think about, is how do I build that network, but also then how do I model that for students? Mm-hmm. So, because this is something that I've tried to incorporate students in. So that, thank you for this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of networks has been so hard in the last couple of years, in particular, because, you know, there haven't really been a lot of conferences. But I think also what's been wonderful is that we've had more virtual conferences, and with virtual conferences given to access to being part of digital humanities communities for people who can't afford or don't have the institutional resources or can't get a visa to travel. And so I'm one of the presidents of the Association for Computers and the Humanities, which is a US focused digital humanities organization. And we have run our conference virtually over the last 2 years. We're going to run it virtually again in 2023 because, you know, we're seeing that so many conferences are going back to being fully in person, and that is then going to bring back these, you know, these sort of economic and political challenges to travel and to being part of communities. I also have seen, and actually they're not doing keynotes, but they're doing like a keynote conversation situation. But the Global DH conference at Michigan State that I mentioned before, they're still doing virtual in the spring, and they just released their call for papers. So, you know, I think finding these, you know, these places that are doing the kind of work and friendly to the kind of work that you do is really the way to build that. You know, we also, so there's Digital Ethnic Futures Consortium, or DEF CON. You know, we have events, virtual networking events, which are opportunities to come and talk to other people and just make connections with other people. The Caribbean Digital, for people in Caribbean studies, like they do similar things. And so it's really like finding the pockets of people and also just asking. I mean, you know me now. And so, you know, I'm always happy to think about how to connect with other groups and other people.
Thank you. We have some questions in the chat. So I'll read, should I give you just one or two questions at a time?
one is, it doesn't matter, whatever's easiest.
I'll just give the first one then. Jude asks, how can minimal computing be applied in the study of African literary websites, either in Africa or the diaspora?
I'd be curious to know what study means here, like what kind of studying of African literary websites. I wonder if Jude's available to unmute and elaborate.
Yes, thank you. Specifically, referring to literary studies context, but at the same time, linking it to the broader world of the digital humanities.
I guess what I'm thinking about is, are you thinking about, what kind of analysis are you thinking about? Is it just
the literary content, the content of these websites are, of course, the literary works, the articles. So it is actually, I asked the question because it's related to the thesis I'm working on at the moment. So I'm much more focused on the circulation and the production of content on these sites and how they're being, circulated through social media platforms, So starting out from these sites and then being extended to social media platforms where they also get shared and, and yeah.
That's a really good question. Yeah, go ahead.
So basically your talk on minimal computing got me wondering, because at the moment, my method is a two-pronged one. And one of them, aside from the conventional literary analysis that we tend to do in literary studies, the other one involves the use of a software called the Power BI, which seems to be a more high-tech kind of thingy. So the thing is, how then do I apply minimal computing so that it doesn't look like I'm using something that is way above the heads of people who are just coming into the field?
Well, I mean, I guess, so I guess the question really is that ultimately, I mean, if the technology gets you what you need to be able to communicate what you want to communicate, it doesn't really matter what you use. I mean, I think what I would be thinking about if I'm thinking about studying what you're studying is I'd be thinking about, how do I find ways that I can access the kinds of data that I need for the kinds of analysis that I want to do? And so, for example, I might think, when thinking about circulation on social media, I might think about, can I get access to the Twitter academic API, which is free, and something that, we can use. You can put in a query, and it's a little more complicated than that, but you can harvest the tweets that or a percentage of tweets that involve authors or links or text that you put in as a search term. I might think about, do I want to scrape the content out of it and then model it, or do textual analysis with, there's like a browser-based topic modeling tool called JSLDA that does topic models, or there's another tool called Voyant that does various kinds of modeling and textual analysis. It's not that minimal computing has a set of tools or has a direct answer to a question like this, but really thinking about, what kind of research question do you have and what can you get access to that will allow you to help answer that research question? Or at least, I mean, research questions are really iterative, so it's not going to be like plug it in and get the answer, right? I wish, but that gets us closer to where we want to get in terms of our inquiry.
Thank you so much. So we have another hand. Korklu, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm joining in from Ghana. And interesting topic. And for most of us, it is difficult. Humanities has been around for a while in the West, but it is now catching on in our part of the world, across the Atlantic, and I think to a large extent, there are people who are engaged in that, but they are working in silos. because they do not know who else is doing what they, this new thing. So there are problems. It's good to know what is going on, but in our own context, we don't even consciously collect primary resources. So you find so much going to waste. We treat a lot of things as trivia, and yet trivia costs money. How do we digitize this so that it is useful to the larger academic community? There is also the issue of equipment. A few weeks ago, we had something about digitizing collections, and we were told, one of the suggestions was that we should use our personal cameras. There are issues involved, institutions, and yet the cost of equipment is so high. You import and you have to pay so much for it. And then there's also the issue of software. You pay for software, subscription is now the thing. You subscribe to it and your money goes, it's a whole lot of network of issues. How do we get help? And then in addition, we are a very much oral society. How do we work with this? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I wish I could answer your questions. These are all really good questions. I think I'm so glad that you have raised these as these sort of structural and financial issues. One of the things that I have been thinking a lot about is so there was a tweet from the Atlanta Archive, I think it was the National Archives office in Atlanta in the US, saying that they had calculated that if they were going to digitize their entire collection, it would take them until, this is like 2,300. That's how much time it would just take given the scope of their collection. While, clearly there's a difference between working in the US and working in Ghana. I worked for 9 years at a university where we had no money for any digital humanities, for the archives. Like the archivists didn't even have money to ask for, file folders. It was a very constrained environment. And I think actually a lot of my thinking on minimal computing came out of working in that environment, where the question was, when we have so little to work with, how do we do what we can with what we have? And so some of the ways we tried to approach this was collaboration, was trying to reach out to other colleagues in similar situations at similar universities. For us, it was, other of these public universities without money, and think about, what kind of sharing can we do? What kind of collaboration can we do? Because we all maybe can access little things, and maybe together can think about how do we pool the little that we have access to work together. I think it can be really overwhelming when we look at, the scale that we've seen with digital humanities, those big projects and things like that, and feel like we could never do that. And, probably in most cases we can't, but that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. And so my whole approach to digital humanities, and I've written about this in terms of, we call it small data, tiny data, that we can make interventions on a really small scale, and share our work and try and then use the small scale work that we've been able to do to make the case for more investment. So I have a project that Sylvia mentioned called Reanimate. It's a feminist publishing collective that started because one of my colleagues wanted to publish a volume, and the press told her there's no market for it. And there's no market for it because nobody's heard of these people. But how do we make people hear of these people if we can't publish anything? So I said, we're going to do it ourselves. So we've had no funding, but we created digital editions of writing by women of color. And now, hilariously enough, that press is willing to do an edition because they saw that we did one and we created a market. And so even though it can be really overwhelming to think about what we don't have access to, what we can't do, I don't ever want to underestimate the small interventions that we can make and that we can try and push and try and change. It's not going to solve the structural issues, but it can help us make the case that this is important work for investment.
Thank you so much. If we could all just give a virtual clap or round of applause for Dr. Risam for the wonderful keynote and really amazing answers to these questions. Thank you so much. I learned a lot and I know that others did.